The mountain man appeared at the edge of Redemption Creek on a morning when the town's only preacher lay dying of consumption, and nobody knew that this stranger would build them salvation with his own scarred hands. Silas Crane stood 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, his dark hair falling past his collar in waves that spoke of months spent in the high country where scissors and mirrors meant nothing. His hands were calloused from axe work and his face weathered from wind, but his eyes held something gentle that didn't match the rest of him. He rode into town on a paint horse in August of 1873, leading a pack mule loaded with furs and not much else, and the people of Redemption Creek watched him with the same suspicion they showed every stranger who wandered down from the mountains. The town sat in the Montana Territory, nestled in a valley where the creek ran cold and clear, surrounded by pine forests that climbed toward peaks still capped with snow even in summer. It was a mining town mostly, with a handful of ranchers scattered in the grasslands beyond, and like most towns carved out of wilderness, it had more saloons than churches and more ways to lose your soul than save it. Silas had come down from the mountains because winter was approaching and because something had been gnawing at him for months, a feeling he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. He had lived alone for 7 years, trapping beaver and fox, selling pelts once or twice a year, speaking to no one for weeks at a time. But lately, the silence had begun to feel less like peace and more like emptiness, and when he heard that Redemption Creek's preacher was dying, something inside him shifted like a compass, finding north. He sold his furs at the trading post and took a room above the general store, paying for a month in advance with coins that chinked heavily on the counter. The proprietor, a thin man named Hutchins with nervous eyes, took his money but didn't smile. Word spread quickly through the town that a mountain man had taken up residence, and the word carried weight because mountain men were known to be half savage, more comfortable with bears than people. Silas didn't help his reputation that first week. He walked the streets with the easy confidence of a man who had faced down grizzlies, his buckskin clothes and thick beard marking him as different from the townspeople in their store-bought fabrics. He spoke little and watched much, and when he finally visited the dying preacher, he went alone and stayed for an hour. Reverend Patterson lay in a back room of the church, a small wooden building with a crooked steeple that leaned slightly to the east. The old man's breathing rattled in his chest, but his mind was clear enough to recognize the hunger in Silas's eyes when he asked about the church's future. "Town doesn't care much," Patterson whispered. "They'll let it fall to ruin soon as I'm gone. Most only came on Easter and Christmas anyway, and that was more habit than faith." Silas sat beside the bed, his large frame making the simple chair creak. "What would it take to keep it going?" Patterson's laugh turned into a cough. "A miracle or a fool. This building's rotting at the foundation, roof leaks, floors warped. Even if we had a new preacher, which we won't, the structure wouldn't last another winter." "What about building a new one?" The old man's eyes sharpened despite his weakness. "You a preacher, son?" "No, sir. Just a man who's spent too long running from God and figures it's time to stop." Patterson studied him for a long moment. "Building a church takes money, materials, and help. This town won't give you any of those things. They'll think you're crazy or scheming, probably both." "Let them think what they want," Silas said quietly. "Where would be the best place to build?" And so it began. Silas bought a plot of land at the edge of town, with money he had saved from 7 years of trapping, a piece of ground that sat on a small rise overlooking the creek. The deed cost him nearly everything he had, but he signed it without hesitation, his signature awkward and unpracticed. The next day, he started clearing the land, pulling stumps with his horse and his own brute strength, leveling the ground with a shovel and determination. People stopped to watch, standing at a distance, muttering among themselves. A few laughed outright. Who did this mountain man think he was, building a church without being asked, without being wanted? The town council called a meeting about it, though Silas wasn't invited. They debated whether to stop him, whether a man had the right to build a church if he wasn't ordained, if he wasn't even civilized. In the end, they decided to let him waste his time and money. The project would fail soon enough, and then he would leave, and things would go back to normal. But Silas didn't fail, and he didn't leave. He worked from sunrise to sunset, cutting timber in the forests, hauling logs down the mountain on a sledge he built himself. His muscles, already formidable from years of hard living, grew even more defined. His hands bled and healed and bled again. He spoke to no one unless spoken to first, and he was rarely spoken to first. 3 weeks into the project, on a Sunday morning when the old church held its final service before Reverend Patterson's death, Silas was at his building site, digging post holes in the rocky soil. He heard the church bell ring, thin and cracked, and he paused to wipe sweat from his face. The sun was already hot despite the early hour, and he had removed his shirt, his chest and arms gleaming with effort. That was when he saw her for the first time. She came walking up the rise toward him, moving with purpose despite the steep grade. She wore a simple brown dress and carried a basket covered with a cloth, her hair pinned up in a way that suggested practicality over fashion. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, he thought, but there was something arresting about her face, an openness and directness in her gaze that made him straighten instinctively. "You're the mountain man building the church," she said when she reached him. It wasn't a question. "Name's Silas Crane, madam." "Evangeline Porter." "Eva." She held out the basket. "I brought you lunch. Figured you might not be stopping to eat otherwise." He stared at the basket like it might contain a rattlesnake. "That's kind of you, but I can't pay you for it." "I'm not asking you to pay. I'm asking you to eat." She set the basket on a stack of lumber and pulled back the cloth, revealing bread and cheese and cold chicken. "You were at Reverend Patterson's bedside when he passed 2 nights ago. Doc Henderson mentioned it. Said you sat with him for hours, reading scripture aloud even after the Reverend couldn't respond anymore." Silas felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the sun. "Seemed like the right thing to do. Man shouldn't die alone." "Most people in this town would disagree with you, or at least they wouldn't have acted on it." Eva gestured to the food. "Please, eat. I'll feel foolish if I carried this all the way up here for nothing." He gave in, partly because he was hungry, and partly because something about her made refusing seem churlish. He sat on a log and ate while she stood looking out over the valley, her back to him, giving him privacy. The food was simple but good, and he found himself eating faster than he meant to. "Why are you doing this?" she asked after a few minutes, still facing away. "Building the church, I mean. Everyone in town is talking about it, coming up with theories. Some think you're trying to swindle us somehow. Others think you've gone mad from too much time alone in the mountains." Silas swallowed a mouthful of bread and considered his answer. "I don't rightly know how to explain it. I've been living alone a long time, and somewhere along the way I lost something. Not lost exactly, more like I left it behind on purpose. But a man can't run forever from what's inside him. When I heard this town was losing its church, I thought maybe building a new one might help me find my way back." She turned to face him then, and he was struck again by the intelligence in her eyes. "That's the most honest thing I've heard in a long time. Most men would have given me some pious speech about serving God and saving souls. I'm not most men, and I'm not pious. I'm just tired of being empty." Something shifted in her expression, a softening he couldn't quite read. "The service is starting at the old church. I should go. You'll be late because of me. I'm sorry." "Don't be. This was more important." She collected the basket, leaving the cloth for him. "I'll come back next Sunday if that's all right. Bring you another meal." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She started down the hill, then paused and looked back. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is brave. Don't let this town's coldness discourage you." She was gone before he could respond, disappearing down the slope toward the old church. Silas sat there for a long moment, the taste of her bread still in his mouth, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time someone had shown him simple kindness without wanting something in return. He went back to work with renewed energy, and when Sunday came again, she returned as promised. This became their pattern. Eva would come Sunday mornings while the town gathered at the old church for services led by a circuit preacher who passed through once a month, and she would bring Silas food and stay to talk. At first, their conversations were brief and carefully neutral, but gradually they deepened, became more personal. He learned that she was 24 years old, that she had come to Redemption Creek 3 years earlier with her father, a mining engineer who had died in a collapse the previous winter. She had stayed because she had nowhere else to go and because she had found work as a seamstress and occasional teacher for the few children in town. She lived in a small house near the creek, supporting herself through careful frugality and determination. She learned that he was 31, that he had grown up in Ohio on a farm, that he had fled west after the war, unable to reconcile the things he had seen and done at Gettysburg with the peaceful life his family wanted him to resume. The mountains had offered escape, but escape and peace weren't the same thing, and he was only now beginning to understand the difference. "Do you miss it?" Eva asked one Sunday in September, watching him shape a roof beam with an adze. "The solitude of the mountains?" Silas paused in his work, considering. The church was taking shape now, its frame rising against the sky, and he could almost see what it would become. "Some days, but mostly no. Turns out being alone and being lonely are two different things, and I spent a lot of years confusing one for the other. And now? Now I'm building something that matters. Or trying to." He set down the adze and looked at her directly. "And I look forward to Sunday mornings in a way I never expected." Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "So do I." The town noticed, of course. People saw Eva climbing the hill every Sunday, saw the way she lingered, the way she smiled when she came back down. The whispers started immediately. What was she thinking, consorting with that mountain man? Didn't she have any sense of propriety? Her reputation would be ruined. The criticism came to a head one evening when Eva was working in her small home, mending a dress by lamplight. 3 women from the town's social committee knocked on her door, their faces set with righteous concern. Mrs. Blackwood, the banker's wife, led the delegation. "Evangeline, we need to speak with you about your behavior, Mrs. Blackwood began without preamble. "Your visits to that mountain man are causing talk. People are beginning to question your character." Eva set down her sewing with deliberate care. "My character is my own concern, Mrs. Blackwood. Not when you're teaching our children, it isn't. What kind of example are you setting, spending unchaperoned time with a man like that?" "A man like what? Someone who works hard and bothers no one? Someone who's trying to build something beautiful for this town, even though the town treats him like an outcast?" "He's not one of us," another woman interjected. "He's wild, uncivilized. Who knows what his real intentions are?" Eva felt anger rising in her throat like bile. "His real intentions are visible for anyone with eyes to see. He's building a church with his own hands and his own money, asking nothing from anyone. Meanwhile, this town, which claims to be civilized and Christian, treats him with nothing but suspicion and contempt. If you want to question someone's character, perhaps you should look in a mirror." The women left in a huff, and Eva knew there would be consequences. Sure enough, within a week, 2 families withdrew their children from her teaching. Her sewing commissions began to dry up. The shopkeepers, who had always greeted her with warmth, now served her with cold efficiency. She told Silas none of this. She continued to climb the hill every Sunday, bringing food she could increasingly ill afford, staying to talk and sometimes to help, handing him tools or holding boards steady while he hammered. The church grew slowly but steadily, its walls rising, its shape becoming solid and real. In October, the first snow came early, dusting the mountains white and making the mornings bitter cold. Silas worked through it, his breath steaming in the air, his hands red and chapped despite the gloves Eva had made him. The church was roofed now, and he had begun work on the interior, building pews from lumber he had milled himself. "You should stop for the winter," Eva said one Sunday when the wind cut through her shawl and made her shiver. "The work will still be here in spring." "Can't stop now. I'm too close." He was planing a board, long curls of wood falling at his feet. "Besides, I made a promise to myself to see this through." "You'll freeze to death." "I've survived worse winters in a canvas tent." "I'll manage." She wanted to argue but recognized the futility. Instead, she began bringing him hot coffee in addition to food, carrying it carefully up the hill in a covered tin. She began staying longer, sometimes helping him sand the pews or sweep sawdust, their breath mingling in the cold air as they worked side by side. It was on one of these days, in late October, that everything changed. They were working inside the church, the walls providing some shelter from the wind. Silas was fitting a window frame, and Eva was holding it steady, standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. His hands were on either side of hers as he adjusted the frame, and suddenly he was acutely aware of her proximity, the warmth of her body, the way her eyes focused intently on the task. Ava, he said quietly. She looked up at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her breath catch. Yes? I need to tell you something. These past months, seeing you every Sunday, talking with you, working beside you, it's been the best part of my life. You're the best part of my life. Her hands trembled slightly under his. Silas, I know I'm not much. A mountain man with rough manners and rougher hands. I know this town looks down on me, and being associated with me has cost you. But I'm asking anyway because I've spent too many years being a coward, and I don't want to be a coward about this. I'm in love with you, Eva. Have been for weeks now, and if there's any chance you might feel the same, I need to know. For a moment she was perfectly still, and Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted to escape. Then Eva smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. You foolish man, she said softly. I've been in love with you since the day I brought you lunch and you looked at me like I had handed you the moon. I thought you'd never say anything. He released the window frame, letting it fall back out of position, and took her face in his hands. They were rough hands, calloused and scarred, but they were gentle when they touched her. Can I kiss you? I'll be very disappointed if you don't. He kissed her there in the half-built church, with sawdust on the floor and cold wind whistling through gaps in the walls, and it was the most perfect moment of his life. She tasted like coffee and hope, and when she wrapped her arms around his neck, he lifted her off her feet without thinking, holding her close against his chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eva laughed. I suppose we're courting now? If you'll have me. I'll have you, though I should warn you it's not going to be easy. This town already dislikes you and they're angry with me for defending you. It's only going to get worse. Silas set her down gently but kept his arms around her. Let them be angry. I face down worse than gossip. We'll manage, long as we're together. It was a bold statement, and one he came to regret in the weeks that followed. The town's hostility escalated when word spread that Silas and Eva were courting. It started with more whispers and pointed fingers, but it quickly grew uglier. Someone broke a window in Eva's house, throwing a rock through it in the night with a note attached that read, "Whore for savages." She found her garden trampled, her laundry torn down and dirtied. The last of her teaching positions evaporated, and the general store began refusing to extend her credit. Silas wanted to confront the perpetrators, wanted to use his fist to defend her honor, but Eva begged him not to. It will only make things worse. Please, just finish the church. That's the best answer we can give them. So he worked harder, faster, driven by anger and love in equal measure. The church's interior took shape through November and into December. He carved altar rails from pine and built a pulpit from oak he had traded for. He installed the windows, precious glass he had ordered from Helena and hauled up himself, and suddenly the interior was filled with light. Eva helped whenever she could, though she was struggling financially, taking in mending from ranchers outside town who hadn't heard the gossip. She was thinner than she had been, Silas noticed, eating less to make her supplies stretch. It broke something in him to see her suffering because of him. "Marry me," he said one evening in early December. They were standing inside the church admiring the completed altar. Outside, snow was falling thick and fast. Eva turned to him with wide eyes. "What?" "Marry me. I know it's fast, and I know I should court you proper for longer, but I can't stand watching you suffer because of me. If we're married, you can move in with me. We'll pool our resources. I can protect you better." "Silas, I'm not suffering because of you. I'm suffering because this town is full of small-minded people who can't stand seeing someone act with integrity. Nevertheless, I love you and I want to marry you, and I don't see any point in waiting. Do you?" She studied his face for a long moment, and he could see her turning it over in her mind, weighing practicality against propriety. Finally, she smiled. "No, I don't see any point in waiting. Yes, Silas Crane, I'll marry you." They married the following week in the completed church, with only Doc Henderson as witness. The old doctor had been one of the few townspeople to treat them with kindness, and he stood beside them with tears in his eyes as Silas read the marriage vows from a Bible that had been his mother's. There was no preacher to officiate, so they simply spoke the words to each other before God and Doc Henderson, exchanging promises in the empty church that smelled of fresh sawdust and pine resin. Silas had carved their wedding rings himself from a piece of maple, simple bands that gleamed golden in the winter light. When he slid the ring onto Ava's finger, his hands were shaking. "I promise to love you and protect you for as long as I live. I promise to be the man you deserve, even if I have to spend every day learning how." Ava's eyes were bright with tears. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to believe in you when you don't believe in yourself. I promise to build a life with you that's full of love and purpose." They kissed as husband and wife in the church Silas had built with his own hands, and Doc Henderson clapped enthusiastically, his applause echoing in the empty space. Ava moved into Silas's room above the general store that night, bringing her few possessions in a single trunk. It was cramped quarters, but neither of them minded. They were together, and that was all that mattered. The town's reaction to their marriage was predictably hostile. People muttered that it was unseemly, hasty, probably necessary if you knew what they meant. But there was nothing anyone could do about it. And slowly, very slowly, the initial furor began to die down, simply because there were no news scandals to feed it. Silas finished the church in January of 1874. It stood on its rise overlooking the creek, simple but beautiful, its white walls bright against the snow. He had carved a cross from cedar for the altar and built steps leading up to the double doors he had hung himself. Inside, the pews sat in neat rows, the windows let in streams of colored light, and everything smelled clean and new. The day he completed it, he and Ava stood outside together, looking up at the building. His arm was around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You did something amazing, Silas." "We did," he corrected. "Couldn't have finished without you." "What happens now?" "Now we see if anyone comes." The first Sunday after the church was completed, Silas rang the bell he had hung in a small belfry. It was a good bell, clear and strong, and its sound carried across the valley. He and Ava sat in the front pew and waited. No one came. They sat through the hour when services would normally be held, the winter sun streaming through the windows, and the church remained empty except for the two of them. Finally, Silas stood and read a psalm aloud, his voice rough with emotion, and they sang a hymn together, their voices small in the empty space. Afterwards, Eva took his hand. "Give them time." "How much time?" "They hate me, Ava. This church could be perfect as Solomon's temple, and they still wouldn't come. Then we'll come, every Sunday, just the two of us, and maybe eventually someone else will join us." So that's what they did. Every Sunday morning, Silas rang the bell, and he and Ava attended services in the empty church. He would read from Scripture, and they would sing hymns, and they would pray together. It was strange at first, performing church services without a congregation, without a preacher, but gradually it began to feel natural, even meaningful. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt, revealing brown grass and the first hints of spring. Silas took work at one of the ranches outside town, helping with calving season and repairs, bringing in money so he and Eva could save toward building a house of their own. Eva's sewing business slowly recovered as ranchers' wives, who cared less about town gossip, sought her out. They were happy, despite everything. They would come home in the evenings to their small room and make dinner together on a single burner, talking about their days, making plans for the future. At night, they would lie in their narrow bed with Silas's arms around Eva, and they would whisper dreams to each other in the darkness. "I want a house with a real kitchen," Eva said one night, "and a garden where I can grow vegetables." "I'll build you one," Silas promised, "soon as we have enough saved." "And children?" "As many as you want." She turned in his arms to face him. "I want at least 3. A full, noisy house." He kissed her forehead. "Then that's what we'll have." Spring came fully in March, and with it, trouble. A group of miners struck silver in the mountains above Redemption Creek, and suddenly the town was flooded with new arrivals. Prospectors, gamblers, prostitutes, all the chaos that followed a mining strike. The saloons were packed every night, fights broke out regularly, and the town's thin veneer of civilization began to crack. The town council, suddenly aware that their growing population included many rough characters, began to worry about lawlessness. They hired a sheriff, a hard man named Cobb who wore his gun low and his authority like armor. One of his first acts was to tour the town, taking stock of its assets and problems. He visited the church on a Saturday morning, finding Silas and Eva there sweeping and preparing for the next day's service. Cobb stood in the doorway, blocking the light, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "This your church?" he asked Silas. "Built it myself." Cobb walked inside slowly, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He looked around with an appraising eye, taking in the craftsmanship, the careful details. "Heard about you. Mountain man who thinks he's a preacher." "Never claimed to be a preacher, just a man who built a church." "Town could use a church," Cobb admitted. "All these new arrivals, they need some civilizing. But they need a real preacher, not some mountain man playing at religion." Eva stepped forward, her broom held like a weapon. "My husband isn't playing at anything. He built this church with his own hands when this town did nothing but mock him. He's held services every Sunday for months while the good Christians of Redemption Creek stayed away." Cobb's eyes flicked to her, and something cold moved in them. "You're the seamstress, the one who married him." "I'm Eva Crane, yes. Heard you were a decent woman before you took up with this one. Shame what happened to your reputation." Silas moved faster than a man his size should have been able to, putting himself between Cobb and Eva. "Say what you came to say and leave." Cobb smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Interesting setup you got here. Pretty little wife, empty church, must get lonely, just the two of you." "We manage." "I'm sure you do." Cobb touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "I'll be seeing you around, Crane. Both of you." He left, and Silas felt Eva's hand on his back, small and trembling. "I don't like him." "Neither do I, but he's the law now. We'll steer clear of him best we can." The next Sunday, something unexpected happened. When Silas rang the bell and he and Eva took their usual places in the front pew, they heard footsteps on the stairs outside. The door opened and a woman entered. She was young, maybe 20, with a hard face and cheap bright dress that marked her profession. She hesitated in the doorway, like she expected to be thrown out, but Eva immediately stood and smiled. "Welcome," Eva said warmly. "Please come in. Sit anywhere you like." The woman, who introduced herself as Sally, took a seat in the back row. She sat through the entire service, listening intently as Silas read from the Gospel of John and led them in singing Amazing Grace. When it was over, she lingered while Eva put away the hymnals. "Thank you for letting me stay," Sally said quietly. "I know I'm probably not welcome." Eva took her hands. "Everyone is welcome in this church. That's what my husband built it for." Sally's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to remember what it felt like to be clean, you know? Just for an hour." "You are clean," Silas said firmly. "God doesn't see what we do for a living. He sees what's in our hearts." Sally came back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. And she wasn't alone. Other women from the saloons began to appear, slipping in quietly, sitting in the back pews. They were followed by miners, rough men with dirt under their nails, who nonetheless sat respectfully and listened. The town's established citizens noticed, of course, and they were horrified. The church that they had ignored when it was empty became a scandal when it filled with undesirables. How dare that mountain man welcome prostitutes and drunks into a house of God? What kind of church was this? The complaints reached Sheriff Cobb, who used them as an excuse to pay another visit. He came during a Wednesday evening when Silas was holding an informal Bible study for anyone who wanted to come. There were perhaps a dozen people present, including Sally and several of her fellow working women, a handful of miners, and Eva. Cobb walked in without knocking, his hand resting on his gun. "Crane, we need to talk." Silas stood slowly, his size making several of the miners shift nervously. "We're in the middle of something. Can it wait?" "No, there have been complaints about your church. People say you're harboring criminals and women of ill repute." "I'm not harboring anyone. I'm holding a Bible study, and everyone is welcome." "Not according to the good people of this town. They don't want their church filled with whores and thieves." Sally flinched at the word, and Eva put a protective arm around her. Silas felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous, the kind of anger that had gotten him in trouble during the war. He forced it down, forced himself to speak calmly. "This isn't their church. I built it. I paid for it. And I'll decide who's welcome. You built it in their town, which means they have a say. I'm ordering you to bar these people from services." "No," Cobb's expression hardened. That wasn't a request. And my answer wasn't a negotiation. This church welcomes everyone. If the town doesn't like it, they can build their own. For a tense moment, Silas thought Cobb might draw his gun. The sheriff's hand twitched toward the holster, and every person in the room held their breath. But then Cobb seemed to think better of it. Instead, he smiled coldly. "You're making enemies, Crane. Powerful enemies. That's not smart for a man in your position. My position is right with God and my conscience. I'll take my chances with everything else." Cobb left, but everyone in the room knew it wasn't over. The miners left quickly after that, nervous about being associated with trouble. But Sally and the other women stayed, and Eva made coffee, and they talked until late into the night about faith and redemption and the courage it took to keep believing in second chances. Over the next few weeks, the pressure intensified. The town council passed an ordinance requiring all public gatherings to be licensed and supervised. Silas ignored it. Someone painted vulgar words on the church's white walls. Silas painted over them. A group of drunk miners tried to start a fight with him outside the general store. He walked away without engaging, his fists clenched but his temper held. Through it all, Eva stood beside him, fierce and unwavering. She faced down the women who whispered about her, held her head high when people crossed the street to avoid her. She welcomed every person who came to the church, learning their names, listening to their stories, showing them the kind of grace the town refused to give. In May, things came to a head. Sheriff Cobb arrested Silas on a trumped-up charge of disturbing the peace, dragging him out of the church during a Sunday service. Eva ran after them, demanding to know what law he had broken, but Cobb ignored her. They kept Silas in jail for 3 days, long enough to miss 2 services, long enough to make a point. Eva visited every day, bringing him food and refusing to leave until Cobb physically escorted her out. On the 3rd day, Doc Henderson posted bail, and Silas was released without explanation or apology. He came home to find Eva sitting on their bed, her face pale and drawn. She had clearly been crying, though she tried to hide it. Silas knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "I'm all right," he said softly. "They didn't hurt me. This time. But what about next time? What if they decide to do more than just jail you?" Her voice broke. "Silas, maybe we should leave. We could go somewhere else, start over where people don't know us." He sat back on his heels, considering. The thought had occurred to him more than once during those 3 days in jail. They could sell the church, pack their belongings, head to Oregon or California, find a place where they could live in peace. But then he thought about Sally, about the hope in her eyes when she sang hymns, about the miners who came to Bible study and listened hungrily to talk of forgiveness, about all the broken people who had found their way to the church because it was the one place in town that didn't judge them. "We can't leave," he said finally. "Not yet. Those people need the church, Eva. They need a place where they're welcome. If we go, where will they go? They're not your responsibility. Maybe not. But they're my calling. Same as you are. Same as this church is." He cupped her face in his hands. "I know I'm asking a lot. I know this isn't the life you imagined. If you want to leave, I'll understand. I'll take you somewhere safe, somewhere you can have the peaceful life you deserve." Ava's eyes flashed with sudden anger. Don't you dare suggest that I would abandon you or this church or those people. We're in this together, Silas Crane, for better or worse, remember? Those were the vows we made. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "I remember. I just needed to know you still did. I do. I always will." They held each other for a long time, drawing strength from each other's presence. When they finally pulled apart, Ava's expression was determined. "We need to be smarter about this. We can't just keep reacting to what the town does. We need a plan." Over the next few days, they formulated one. Silas would continue holding services and Bible studies, but he would document everything, keep records of who attended and what was discussed. Eva would write letters to territorial authorities, explaining the harassment they were facing and requesting oversight. And they would reach out to the circuit preacher, the one who had occasionally held services at the old church, and ask him to officially recognize their church. The circuit preacher, a Methodist minister named Reverend Hughes, arrived in June. He was an older man with kind eyes and a practical air, and he listened carefully as Silas and Eva explained the situation. Then he asked to see the church. Silas led him up the hill, his heart pounding with nervousness. Everything depended on Hughes's reaction. If he rejected the church, declared it illegitimate, they would have no defense against the town's attacks. Hughes walked through the building slowly, examining every detail. He ran his hands over the pews, studied the windows, stood at the pulpit. Finally, he turned to Silas with a slight smile. "You built this entirely yourself?" "Yes, sir, with my wife's help." "It's beautiful work, honest work, the kind of work that glorifies God through craftsmanship." Hughes sat in one of the pews, gesturing for Silas and Eva to join him. "Tell me about your congregation." Silas explained about the prostitutes and minors, the outcasts and unwanted. He told Hughes about holding services for months with just himself and Eva, about welcoming everyone who came regardless of their past. Hughes listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When Silas finished, Hughes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know the story of Zacchaeus? The tax collector who climbed a tree to see Jesus? That's the one. Everyone hated Zacchaeus. He was a cheat and a collaborator. But when Jesus came to town, he didn't go to the synagogue to meet with the righteous Pharisees. He went to Zacchaeus' house, he dined with the sinner, and in doing so, he saved him." Hughes looked around the church. "I think Jesus would have liked this place. I think he would have been first in the door, sitting among the prostitutes and minors, welcoming them home." Relief flooded through Silas so intensely he felt dizzy. "Then you'll recognize the church, make it official?" "I'll do better than that. I'll conduct a proper service here next Sunday, and I'll announce to the whole town that this church operates under the authority of the Methodist Episcopal Church with my full blessing. Anyone who attacks it attacks the church itself." The service that Sunday was the fullest the church had ever been. Word had spread that Reverend Hughes would be preaching, and people came out of curiosity or respect for Hughes, or simply because they wanted to see what would happen. The pews filled with a strange mix of town establishment, miners, saloon workers, and ranchers from the surrounding area. Silas and Eva sat in the front row, her hand gripped tightly in his. He could feel the tension in the room, the way the different groups eyed each other suspiciously. But Hughes climbed into the pulpit with calm authority, and when he began to speak, even the most skeptical listeners leaned forward. He preached about grace, about how God's love was available to everyone regardless of their station or their sins. He talked about Jesus welcoming the outcasts, the way the early church had been made up of slaves and prostitutes and tax collectors. And then he turned his attention directly to Silas. "Fry, this church was built by a man the town rejected," Hughes said, "a mountain man with rough manners and rougher hands. Many of you mocked him when he started. Many of you spread rumors and made his life difficult. But he persevered, and he built this beautiful house of God with his own labor and his own money. And when it was finished, he didn't close the doors to those who had scorned him. He opened them to everyone, especially the least and the lost." Hughes paused, letting his words sink in. "That, friends, is what Christianity looks like. Not judgment and exclusion, but love and welcome. Not pride and self-righteousness, but humility and service. Silas Crane has built more than a church. He's built a testament to what faith in action means, and I'm proud to officially recognize this church and commission it for service in God's kingdom." The silence that followed was profound. Silas felt Eva's hand trembling in his, felt his own eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. Around the room, people looked uncomfortable, confronted with truths they didn't want to acknowledge. Then, from the back of the church, someone started clapping. It was Doc Henderson, his weathered face split with a huge grin. One by one, others joined him. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough. The miners applauded, and the saloon women, and a handful of ranchers who had come to respect Silas's work ethic and character. Even a few of the townspeople, shamed by Hughes's words, added their applause. After the service, people lingered. Several townspeople who had previously ignored Silas approached to shake his hand, their apologies awkward but seemingly sincere. Mrs. Blackwood, the banker's wife who had led the delegation against Eva, came over with tears in her eyes. "I was wrong about you," she said simply, "about both of you. I let fear and prejudice guide me when I should have been guided by faith. I hope you can forgive me." Eva took her hands. "There's nothing to forgive. We're all learning how to be better." The town didn't transform overnight. There were still people who disliked Silas, still whispers and occasional hostility. But something had shifted. The church was no longer just Silas and Eva's project. It had become a recognized institution, protected by the authority of the Methodist Church and the respect Reverend Hughes commanded. More importantly, it had proven itself necessary. The influx of miners had brought chaos to Redemption Creek, but the church provided a stabilizing influence. Men who might have spent their Sundays drunk and fighting instead spent them in the pews, listening to talk of morality and purpose. Women who had been treated as disposable found dignity and community. Sheriff Cobb, recognizing that public sentiment had turned, stopped his harassment. He even began attending services occasionally, standing at the back with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. As summer progressed, Silas and Eva's life began to settle into something like normalcy. Silas found steady work as a carpenter, his skills in high demand as the town grew. Eva's sewing business flourished, and she began teaching again, this time at the church where no one could fire her. They saved money steadily, planning for the house they wanted to build. On warm evenings, they would walk along the creek, talking about what it would look like, how many rooms it should have, where the kitchen window should face. "I want to be able to see the church from our house," Eva said one evening. They were sitting on the creek bank, watching the water flow past, Silas's arm around her shoulders. "So we can always remember where we started. Where we started was me alone in the mountains, and you alone in this town. What we built together is what matters." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We built something good, didn't we? We built something extraordinary." He kissed the top of her head. "You know what else we should start building?" "What?" "A family. We've been married 6 months now. Maybe it's time." Eva tilted her face up to look at him, her eyes soft. "I've been hoping you'd say that. I think a baby would be perfect right about now." They made love that night with a new intentionality, and as Silas held Eva afterwards, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, he felt a completeness he had never known existed. This was what he had been searching for during all those years alone in the mountains. Not just peace, but purpose. Not just solitude, but connection. Not just survival, but love. Eva became pregnant in August, though they didn't know it for certain until September, when her monthly courses failed to arrive and she began feeling sick in the mornings. Silas was beside himself with joy and worry, suddenly treating her like she was made of glass. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Eva said with amusement when he insisted on carrying her up the stairs to their room. "Women have been doing this since Eve. You're not just any woman. You're my woman, carrying my child. I'm allowed to fuss. Fuss all you want, but I'm still going to work and attend services and live my life. At least let me do the heavy lifting. That I'll agree to." They told the congregation the news the following Sunday, and the church erupted in celebration. Sally and the other women from the saloons surrounded Eva with tears and advice, treating the baby like it belonged to all of them. The miners gruffly congratulated Silas and slipped Eva presents they had carved from wood or stone. Even some of the townspeople who had been cold to them began to warm up, because a baby was a baby, and that transcended most prejudices. As fall arrived and Eva's belly began to swell, Silas threw himself into building their house. He had purchased land near the church, and he worked every spare moment cutting timber and laying foundation. Several men from the church volunteered to help, and what had seemed like an overwhelming project became manageable with many hands. The house took shape through October and November, rising from the ground with a speed that amazed even Silas. It wasn't large, just 4 rooms and a loft, but it was solid and well built, with a big kitchen for Eva and a porch where they could sit in the evenings. Best of all, from the front window, you could see the church on its hill, white and beautiful against the sky. They moved into the house in December, just before the first major snowfall. Eva waddled through the empty rooms with delight, planning where furniture would go, exclaiming over the pantry Silas had built in the window seat in what would be the baby's room. "It's perfect," she kept saying. "Absolutely perfect." "You're perfect," Silas corrected, pulling her into his arms as best he could with her belly between them. "The house is just wood and nails." They spent their first Christmas in their new home, celebrating with a small group from the church. Sally came, and Doc Henderson, and several of the miners who had nowhere else to go. Ava cooked a goose and potatoes, and they sang carols around the fireplace Silas had built. It was simple and chaotic and absolutely perfect. The baby came in March of 1875, arriving during a late winter storm that dumped 2 feet of snow on Redemption Creek. Ava's labor started in the middle of the night, and Silas rode through the blizzard to fetch Doc Henderson, his heart in his throat with fear. "She'll be fine," Doc Henderson assured him as they rode back. "First babies take their time. We'll be there long before anything happens." But Ava's labor progressed faster than expected, and by the time they arrived back at the house, she was already pushing. Silas stayed by her side through the whole ordeal, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement even as he silently prayed harder than he ever had in his life. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and screaming, Silas wept openly. He held the tiny, perfect creature in his large hands and felt his heart crack open with love. "He's beautiful," Eva said weakly from the bed, exhausted but glowing. "What should we name him?" Silas looked down at his son, at the tiny fingers curled into fists, the dark hair plastered to his skull. "Samuel, after my father." "Samuel Crane," Eva tested the name. "I like it. Sam." Little Sam proved to be a healthy, hungry baby who cried lustily and often. Silas learned to function on no sleep, walking the floor with his son at all hours while Eva recovered. He was fiercely protective, hovering whenever anyone came to visit, relaxing only when he was certain they were being gentle with the baby. "You're going to have to let other people hold him eventually," Eva said with amusement, watching Silas watch Doc Henderson examine Sam. "I will, when he's older." "How much older?" 18. Maybe 21. Eva laughed, and the sound filled the house with warmth. As spring arrived and Eva regained her strength, they settled into new rhythms. Eva would bring Sam to church services wrapped in a blanket, and the congregation would take turns holding him while she sang hymns. Silas built a cradle for the church so Sam could sleep during the longer services, and it became a symbol of the life and growth happening in their community. The church continued to thrive. More miners attended regularly, and slowly, very slowly, more townspeople began to join them. The two groups didn't always mix comfortably, but they were learning to coexist, united by faith and the force of Silas and Ava's example. Sheriff Cobb even showed up one Sunday with an awkward request. His deputy had been shot during a bar fight, and Cobb wanted Silas to pray for him. Silas agreed immediately, and they stood together at the deputy's bedside, while Silas offered a prayer for healing. The deputy survived, and Cobb never openly thanked Silas, but his attitude shifted from hostile to grudgingly respectful. As Sam grew from infant to toddler, Redemption Creek grew around them. The silver mines continued to produce, attracting more settlers. The town built a proper school and a larger general store. A railroad spur was planned to connect them to Helena. The chaos of the boom period began to mature into something more stable. Through it all, the church remained a constant, its bell ringing every Sunday morning, its doors open to anyone who wanted to enter. Silas had stopped leading services himself once a young preacher named Thomas Yates arrived seeking a permanent position. Silas happily stepped aside, content to sit in the pews with Ava and Sam and let someone with proper training handle the spiritual leadership. But everyone still knew whose church it was, whose hands had built it, whose faith had sustained it through opposition, whose love had made it a true sanctuary. On their 3rd wedding anniversary, Eva told Silas she was pregnant again. They were sitting on their porch watching Sam chase butterflies in the yard, the church visible on its hill in the distance. "Already?" Silas said with delight. "I thought we'd have more time between them." "Apparently not. Are you disappointed?" "Disappointed? Ava, I'm thrilled. The more the merrier as far as I'm concerned." Their daughter arrived in early 1876, an easy birth compared to Sam's dramatic entrance. They named her Lily, and she was her mother's daughter from the start, calm and observant where Sam was wild and loud. Life settled into a pattern that felt almost dreamlike in its contentment. Silas worked as a carpenter and occasionally returned to the mountains for short trapping expeditions, always bringing home stories and furs and treats for the children. Ava sewed and taught and managed their growing household with graceful efficiency. They held Bible studies in their home on Wednesday evenings, and their house was always full of people, laughter, the smell of coffee and baking bread. Sally remained a close friend, eventually leaving the saloon to work as Eva's assistant in the sewing business. Doc Henderson became like family, teaching Sam to whittle and slipping him peppermints when Eva wasn't looking. Years passed. Sam and Lily grew and were joined by two more siblings, another boy named Peter and a girl named Grace. The house, which had seemed so spacious when they built it, became full of noise and life and love. Silas's hair began to show gray at the temples, and Eva's face gained laugh lines around her eyes. But they moved through life together with the same partnership and passion they had shared from the beginning, still stealing kisses when the children weren't watching, still talking late into the night about dreams and plans. The church thrived under Reverend Yates's leadership, but Silas remained deeply involved, serving on the board, maintaining the building, ensuring that the original mission of welcoming everyone remained central. New people continued to arrive in Redemption Creek, and they found their way to the white church on the hill, drawn by its reputation for grace and acceptance. On a Sunday morning in 1882, 9 years after Silas first appeared at the edge of town, the church held a special service to celebrate its anniversary and to dedicate an addition Silas had built. The original structure had become too small for the growing congregation, and Silas had spent the past year expanding it, adding more pews and a larger gathering space. The church was packed that morning, standing room only. The town's mayor was there, and Sheriff Cobb, and Mrs. Blackwood, and countless others who had once scorned the mountain man and his project. Sally sat with her husband, a miner she had married 2 years earlier, their baby daughter on her lap. Doc Henderson beamed from his usual seat near the front, and in the very first pew sat Eva and Silas, their 4 children arranged between them. Sam was 7 now, already showing signs of his father's size and strength. Lily was 5, bookish and serious. Peter was 3, constantly in motion, and Grace was just 1, sleeping peacefully in Eva's arms. Reverend Yates stood at the pulpit and spoke about the church's history, about how it had started with one man's vision and grown into a cornerstone of the community. Then he invited Silas to say a few words. Silas stood reluctantly, uncomfortable with public speaking despite years of practice. He looked out at the crowd, at all the faces turned toward him expectantly, and felt Eva's hand squeeze his. "I'm not much for speeches," he began. "Never have been. But I want to say something today about what this church means to me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 9 years ago, I came down from the mountains because I was empty inside. I'd spent years running from myself, from God, from any kind of connection. I thought I was being strong, being independent, but I was just being lonely. He looked down at Eva, at his children. Building this church gave me purpose, but it was just wood and nails until my wife walked up that hill with a basket of food and stayed to talk to me. She was the first person to see past the rough exterior to what I was trying to do. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And because of her, I learned that buildings don't make a church. People do. Love does. His voice roughened with emotion. This church has been many things over the years. A sanctuary, a meeting place, a symbol. But mostly it's been a reminder that grace is real, that second chances exist, that nobody is beyond redemption. Every person who walks through these doors, whether they're a banker or a miner or a woman from the saloon, they're walking into a place that says, "You are welcome, you are valued, you belong." He looked at Reverend Yates. "That's all I wanted to say. Just thank you to everyone who has been part of this journey, especially to my wife, who has been my partner, my inspiration, and my better half every step of the way." The congregation applauded, and Silas sat down quickly, his face red. Eva leaned over and kissed his cheek, whispering, "I love you." "Love you too," he murmured back. "Always." After the service, there was a celebration with food and music. Children ran around the church grounds while adults talked and laughed. Silas found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, to share memories of the early days, to tell him how much the church had meant to them. But eventually, he managed to extract himself and find Eva. She was standing apart from the crowd, looking up at the church with a small smile. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That we did good. We built something that's going to last long after we're gone." We built more than a church. We built a life, a family, a home. She turned in his arms to face him. Remember when you asked me if I regretted choosing you? Choosing this life instead of something easier? I remember you telling me not to be foolish. I want to say it again, just so there's no doubt. I have never regretted a single moment, not the hardship, not the gossip, not the struggle. Because every moment led to this, to us, to our children, to this community we've built together. Tears shimmered in her eyes. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Silas Crane, and I would choose you 1,000 times over. He kissed her there in front of everyone, a deep kiss that made several people whistle and call out teasing comments. When they broke apart, both smiling, Silas saw Sheriff Cobb watching them from across the yard. The old sheriff raised his glass in a silent toast, and Silas returned the gesture. So much had changed, so much had been built, had grown, had flourished. As the sun began to set and people started heading home, Silas and Eva gathered their children and walked back to their house. Sam and Lily ran ahead, racing each other, while Silas carried Peter on his shoulders and Eva held Grace. "Papa," Peter said, pulling on Silas's hair, "tell us the story again about when you built the church." "You've heard that story 100 times," Silas said with a laugh, "but I want to hear it again." So as they walked home in the fading light, Silas told the story one more time, about coming down from the mountains empty and lost, about building a church with his own hands while the town watched with scorn, about a brave woman who brought him food and stayed to talk. "And then what happened?" Lily asked, even though she knew the answer. "Then I fell in love with her," Silas said, smiling at Eva, "and she was crazy enough to fall in love with me back. And we got married in the church I built, and we started filling it with people who needed a place to belong." "Was Mama the very first person in the church?" Sam asked. Eva and Silas exchanged a look, remembering those early Sundays when it was just the two of them in the empty building. "She was," Silas confirmed, "the very first and the last to leave at the end of every service. Still is." "Why?" Peter asked. Eva answered this time. "Because your father built something beautiful out of nothing. He took his pain and loneliness and turned it into something that blessed everyone around him. I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to help him carry the weight of it." "And because she loved me," Silas added softly, "even when I was hard to love." They reached their house and went inside, the children immediately dispersing to their various activities. Eva started preparing dinner while Silas lit the lamps, moving through their evening routine with practiced ease. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Silas and Eva sat on their porch in the gathering darkness. They could see the church on its hill, lit by moonlight, solid and permanent against the night sky. "Think we'll add more rooms to the house?" Eva asked. "If we have more children?" Silas looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Are we having more children?" "I don't know. Maybe. I like the noise and chaos, don't you?" He pulled her close and she settled against him with a contented sigh. "I like anything that makes you happy. If you want 10 children, we'll have 10 children. If you want to stop at 4, we'll stop at 4. Let's just see what happens," Eva said. "I've learned that the best things in life aren't planned. They just unfold." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, to the distant gurgle of the creek. Inside the house, one of the children called out in their sleep, and Eva started to rise, but the child settled again, and she relaxed back into Silas's arms. "Do you ever miss it?" Eva asked quietly. "The mountains? The solitude?" Silas considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the quiet, but I don't miss the loneliness, not for a second. This life, with you and the children and the church and the community, this is what I was always meant to have. I just didn't know it until I found you." "Or until I found you?" "That too." As the years continued to pass, Silas and Eva's family grew in ways both expected and unexpected. Eva did become pregnant again, giving birth to twin boys when Sam was 10. The twins, named Jacob and Joshua, were identical and inseparable, completing their family at 7 children. The house had to be expanded again, and this time Sam and several of the older boys from the church helped Silas with the construction. It became a teaching moment, with Silas showing them how to measure and cut, how to fit joints properly, how to do work that would last. The church continued to evolve as well. Reverend Yates eventually moved on to a larger congregation in Helena, and his replacement, a young woman named Reverend Sarah Mitchell, became the first female pastor in the territory. Her appointment was controversial, but Silas and Eva supported her enthusiastically, and her intelligence and compassion quickly won over even the skeptics. Sally's story had a happy ending too. She and her husband prospered, opening a small restaurant in town. She credited the church, and specifically Eva's friendship, with giving her the courage to leave the saloon and build a different life. When her daughter was old enough, Sally began teaching Sunday school, passing on the grace she had received. Doc Henderson lived to see his 80th birthday, celebrated with a party at the church that drew people from 3 counties. He died peacefully in his sleep shortly after, and Silas and Sam built his coffin from cedar, lining it with velvet Eva sewed. The church was packed for his funeral, a testament to how much he had meant to the community. Sheriff Cobb retired and was replaced by a younger man who had grown up attending the church. The new sheriff consulted Silas regularly about town matters, valuing his perspective and experience. Silas never sought leadership positions, but leadership found him anyway, and he accepted the responsibility with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. As Sam grew into a young man, he showed interest in both his father's carpentry skills and his mother's faith. He began helping Reverend Mitchell with youth programs at the church, and he built his own small chapel on land Silas gave him, using the techniques his father had taught him. Lily became a teacher, eventually taking over Eva's role educating the town's children. She was strict but fair, beloved by her students, and she never married, claiming she was too busy and too content to need a husband. The younger children found their own paths. Peter went into mining, but was known as an ethical operator who treated his workers well. Grace became a nurse, studying in Helena, and then returning to serve her hometown. Jacob and Joshua opened a freight business together, inseparable as always, eventually expanding to serve most of Montana territory. Through all of it, Silas and Eva remained the steady center, their love for each other and their faith anchoring not just their family, but the entire community. They grew old together gracefully, their hair turning white, their movements slowing, but their partnership as strong as ever. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the church threw them a celebration. The building had been expanded twice more by then, and it still filled to capacity. Sam, now married with children of his own, stood and gave a speech about his parents. "My father built this church with his hands," Sam said, "but my parents built a family and a community with their hearts. They taught us that faith isn't just what you believe, it's what you do. They showed us that love means staying when things get hard, that grace means welcoming people others reject, that courage means standing up for what's right, even when you're standing alone." He looked at Silas and Eva sitting in their usual spot in the front pew, their hands clasped together. "They gave us the greatest gift parents can give their children. They showed us how to live with integrity, how to love without condition, how to build something that matters. Everything good in my life, I owe to them." There wasn't a dry eye in the church, and when Sam finished speaking, the congregation stood and applauded. Silas, now in his 50s, with gray shot through his dark hair and beard, stood and helped Eva to her feet. She was still beautiful to him, her face lined but her eyes bright, her hand steady in his. They didn't say anything. They just stood there while their children, grandchildren, and the community they had built celebrated them. It was more than enough. Silas died at the age of 68, having lived a full and meaningful life. It was winter, and he had been out checking on a widow's roof after a heavy snow. He came home cold and exhausted, and Eva made him tea and put him to bed. He died in his sleep sometime during the night, peacefully, with Eva beside him. The funeral was held at the church, of course, and people came from all over the territory to pay their respects. The building couldn't hold everyone, so they opened the windows and doors, and people stood outside in the snow to listen to the service. Sam spoke, his voice breaking as he talked about his father's strength, his gentleness, his unwavering faith. Lily read from Ecclesiastes, about there being a time for every purpose under heaven. Grace sang a hymn their father had loved. But it was Eva who gave the final words. She stood at the pulpit, tiny and white-haired, but still radiating strength, and she looked out at the overflowing church. "Silas built this church 43 years ago when this town hated him," she began. He built it alone, with his own hands and his own money, because he believed in something bigger than himself. He believed in grace, in redemption, in second chances. He believed that everyone deserves a place to belong. She paused, her voice steady despite her tears. I was the first person to walk through these doors when they were still just a frame of raw lumber. I brought him lunch one Sunday, and I stayed to talk. And I kept coming back, Sunday after Sunday, until I realized I was falling in love with him. She smiled through her tears. He was the best man I ever knew. Strong and gentle, fierce and kind. He protected the weak and welcomed the outcast. He built with his hands and loved with his whole heart. And he taught us all what it means to live a life that matters. Her voice broke. I was the first one in this church all those years ago, and I'll be the last one to leave today. Because this building is his legacy, yes, but more than that, it's a reminder that one person acting on faith and love can change everything. Silas changed me. He changed this town. He changed countless lives. She looked at his coffin, simple and beautiful, made by Sam's hands. Rest well, my love. You built something that will last forever. And I'll see you again when my work here is done. Eva lived another 12 years after Silas's death, cared for by her children and grandchildren. She continued to attend church every Sunday, sitting in the front pew where she and Silas had always sat. She was a beloved fixture, the matriarch of the family and the community, keeper of stories and dispenser of wisdom. She died peacefully at the age of 80, surrounded by family, her last words a whispered, "I'm coming, Silas." Her funeral was as well attended as his had been, and she was buried beside him on the hill overlooking the church, in a plot they had selected years earlier. Their graves were simple, just their names and dates and a single phrase Silas had carved into the stone. Together in this life and the next. The church continued long after they were gone, expanding and evolving, but never losing the spirit of welcome and grace they had instilled. Sam took over his father's role as unofficial guardian of the building, maintaining it with the same care Silas had shown. When Sam died, his son took over, and then his son. Generation after generation, the family that Silas and Eva had built continued to serve the church Silas had built with his hands. Stories were passed down about the mountain man who appeared out of nowhere and built a church while the town jeered, about the brave woman who believed in him when no one else did, about how they opened the doors to everyone, especially the ones society rejected, about how their love transformed not just each other, but an entire community. Decades later, when Montana became a state and Redemption Creek grew into a proper city, the church was designated a historical landmark. By then, it was called the Crane Memorial Church, though everyone still called it Silas's Church or the Old Church on the Hill. The building had been expanded and renovated multiple times, but the original structure remained at its heart, Silas's careful craftsmanship still visible in the beams and joints. And in the front pew, a small brass plaque marked the spot where Silas and Eva had sat for over 40 years. Here sat Silas and Eva Crane, the plaque read. He built this church with his hands. She filled it with her heart. Together they built a legacy of love, faith, and welcome that continues to this day. And every Sunday, when the bell rang, people still came. The fashions changed, the faces changed, even the denominations changed over the years. But the essential spirit remained the same. Everyone was welcome, everyone belonged, everyone deserved grace. Because a mountain man had once built a church for a town that hated him, and a brave woman had been the first one in and the last one to leave. And together they had shown that love and faith and stubborn determination could transform the world. Their story became legend, told and retold, embellished and simplified, but at its core remaining true. A man alone in the wilderness had heard a call and answered it. A woman had seen worth in him when others saw only difference. Together, they had built something that lasted not just years, but generations, not just in wood and stone, but in hearts and lives. The church still stands today, white and beautiful on its hill, overlooking the town that grew up around it. And though Silas and Eva are long gone, buried side by side in the small cemetery behind the building, their presence remains. In the strength of the beams Silas shaped with his own hands, in the welcome offered to every person who walks through the doors, in the faith that believes everyone deserves a second chance, in the love that builds not just buildings but families, communities, legacies. And on quiet Sunday mornings, when the light streams through the windows just right, some people swear they can see two figures sitting in the front pew. A large man with dark hair and gentle eyes, holding the hand of a woman whose face radiates kindness and strength. They're just stories, of course, legends. The kind of tales communities tell themselves to remember who they are and where they came from. But maybe, just maybe, some stories are true in ways that transcend facts and dates. Maybe some love really does last forever. Maybe some legacies really do endure. And maybe, just maybe, in a white church on a hill in Montana, a mountain man and his brave wife are still keeping watch over the community they loved, the family they built, the faith they lived. Because that's what love does. It builds, it endures, it transforms the world one heart at a time, and it never, ever ends.